Hi everyone, and welcome to another Luca lecture. Today I wanted to talk about a contemporary artist, one of the more important artists arguably that's still alive, and that is Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei is known for his work not only as a Chinese artist and as a critiquer of Chinese government, but also as an international artist who's very active in humanitarian rights. Ai Weiwei was born on the 28th of August in 1957 in Beijing. His father was actually a poet, and because of that, his family was actually sent into exile in 1958. I was only about 1 years old at the time. They then actually went on to another location, but they lived in exile essentially until we have the death of Mao Zedong, and then the family will return to Beijing. In 1978, he enrolls in the Beijing Film Academy, and between the periods of 1978 to 1983, he was a part of the Stars avant-garde group. In 1981, he moved to the United States, where he first moved to various locations, including Philadelphia and San Francisco, and eventually would live in New York City. He would join the Art Students League of New York from 1983 to 1986, and he actually became friends with Allen Ginsberg by way of his father, again, both of them being poets. He was essentially making money by drawing portraits in the streets. If you've ever seen like a street artist in New York, that's what he did. And then very famously in 1989, we had the Tiananmen Square protests, and in 1993 he returns to China and becomes part of the avant-garde group there in Beijing. When we look at some of his early work, it is this fusion between traditional Chinese art and pop art that you would find in America around this time. We know that Ai Weiwei was very much interested in many of the pop artists, as we'll see from the next series that he actually did while he was in New York, and that's actually a series of photographs called the New York Photographs. And each of these has this kind of feeling to it of Ai Weiwei's emotional position while he's there in New York City, and kind of being in this outsider image of the individual within the larger city. As mentioned, he was interested in Warhol, and we really see a lot of his early influences while he's there in New York with the work that he's actually creating. Not only do we have Warhol as an influence, but we can also see Marcel Duchamp, the famous conceptual artist, really the godfather of conceptual art, also in profile of Marcel Duchamp, which is just a wire piece that has been made into the profile of Duchamp with his famous very long nose there. Very much, if you know Duchamp, it's a perfect image of his profile. We also see a lot of conceptual pieces of art, like this one, Last Ashes of the Smoking Generation, where we essentially have him smoking a whole cigarette and collecting the ashes, this idea of the totality of one thing contained, but this is a very much a Marcel Duchamp type of art piece. When Ai Weiwei returns to China, a lot of the work that he engages in is photography based off of performance pieces. In this piece, we have a young lady lifting up her dress, which doesn't really seem like a big deal, but this is actually against the law to do there in China, and they are in Tiananmen Square. One of the more famous things that he did that was documented is the dropping of a Han Dynasty urn, where he's just very simply taking an antique from Chinese history and dropping it and photographing himself in the process. This image has been one of notoriety throughout his career. This, of course, being problematic to many people that he would just take an antique and willingly destroy it. As a point of conversation, I don't think that the point is lost. I think that he's making a statement about kind of the history of art within China and even reestablishing what the boundaries or rules of what art should be within his own culture. I think that it's very easy to look at a piece like this and not see the overarching political statement. And of course, if he's in China during this period, everything that they're really doing is generated through this kind of critique of the government there at the time. We also see the beginnings of what will be his perspective photographs, where he is essentially extending out his hand and flipping the bird, if you will, to different monuments or pieces of art. If you look closely, he's flipping off the Mona Lisa in this one, but in the most of his work, it's actually directed more towards government. And here's another example of this again with Berlin. He has a whole series of these where he's gone around the world and essentially had this same posturing with different government buildings. When we turn and go back to look at the physical objects that he was creating, most of it was repurposing, again, of traditional things that we would find in Chinese culture, like this Han jar overpainted with the Coca-Cola logo. And again, this is almost blasphemous on some levels to some people, but I think that that's the point, is his kind of incorporation of the contemporary there with this kind of tradition and reflecting what China was to him at the time, which was this amalgamation of both the past and the present, and how these things are structurally working together. He also takes wood that's been repurposed from different temples and actually creates different objects out of them, including benches like the one we're witnessing here. He will go through a whole series of kind of recreations of traditional objects based on wood throughout, and this is kind of the beginning of that ideology. We again have other things like these colored vases from the Han Dynasty, again individually painted, creating over the top of an ancient creation. Another important sculptural element that he begins around this time is his use of bicycles. In this piece, Forever from 2003, he's using 42 bicycles to essentially create an installation. Throughout his career, this will just get exponentially larger and larger, and we'll have these incredibly large bicycle sculptures to enjoy. Ai Weiwei was also one of the artistic consultants on the famous Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium that was constructed in China, even though very quickly afterwards he kind of regretted the decision and has very much distanced himself from the project. As we continue to look at the physical objects that he created during this period, we again see a lot of repurposing of materials from Chinese history, very much like we had witnessed before. Here we have a rough map of China created from wood from a dismantled Qin Dynasty temple. One of the other interesting things he does is the repurposing of tables and other pieces of furniture. In this case, from the Ming Dynasty, we have a table that he has created a sculpture out of. Again, we have this kind of concept of repurposing past art into contemporary art. Here are a few more examples of this style of creation that he has been engaged in throughout his entire artistic career. In 2008, there was an 8.0 earthquake that was experienced in China, and this gave way to a tremendous amount of destruction, including the death of 69,000 people. There then began a series of projects that Ai Weiwei began in connection to this. The most famous, of course, is Straighten, where he actually took beams from different buildings and actually had them straightened and has put them in essentially an installation space. Much of the shoddy conditions of the buildings that had collapsed were actually documented by Ai Weiwei in addition to his other projects. He is a documentary filmmaker as well. This is also during the time period that he received a cerebral hemorrhage after he was beaten by the Chinese police for trying to testify for one of his acquaintances in relationship to these faulty buildings. Again, this is an entire period of his work that's kind of generated out of this tragedy, and this further deepens his relationship with China as both a protester and an artist in terms of the avant-garde within that society. And from that, we actually have a series of schools that were actually destroyed by way of the earthquake, and the Chinese government uh, brushed aside the names of the individuals and kind of made them unknown. And Ai Weiwei took it upon himself with some other individuals to make protest art pieces in connection to this tragedy. We have She Lived Happily for 7 Years in This World, a very large Chinese scroll of a banner, but when on closer examination, it's actually constructed out of backpacks that school children would have worn around the age that they had lost within the buildings that had collapsed. 9,000 total backpacks were used in this piece that was held in the Kunstmuseum in Munich. And so Ai Weiwei and others created the Citizens Investigation, which was an effort to essentially figure out who these children were that were missing and not accounted for by the Chinese government, and just give them a proper understanding of their life and their existence rather than just pretending that they weren't there altogether. What happened was he was able to collect 5,385 names as of 2009. And essentially, this is very much frowned upon by the Chinese government. The online site was taken down, and this continued to create friction between Ai Weiwei and the government, which leads to, as I mentioned before, him being beaten in 2009. And he did have a cerebral hemorrhage that resulted from this, and this is something that he did not have treated immediately because he did not know it was there. Eventually, he is actually operated on in Germany. When we look at his work from this period, we again see these objects that have a connection to Chinese culture, either directly or indirectly. Things like the backpack, which very famously is associated with the Chinese student we see here, replay or reconnected in the sense to make a snake on the ceiling of the Brooklyn Museum. We also see him to begin working with multiples. Here we have Harmonious Society, again a reflection back to the concepts of China, with 3,200 porcelain crabs all painted in various ways and kind of piled together to make a statement. When you look at them all together, they make this wonderful kind of circular form, but you can see that certain crabs are starting to break out of what you would think of as the general concept of the harmonious society. This is the first of many of these massive numbered projects that he does with porcelain, again connecting it back to the culture of China. In 2010, he was placed under house arrest, and a surveillance camera was actually placed outside of the front door of his studio entrance. And as a way of kind of coping with it, he actually made a marble version of this surveillance camera. And this was a series of objects that he would create from marble, including other things like this marble helmet that was created in 2010. It's also from this period, and I think that this is tailoring off of the piece with the crabs. He begins to create or have made these porcelain sunflower seeds, and you can see a wonderful collection of them there in this jar, but he starts to essentially have these created in mass, and what happens is he creates these incredibly large installation pieces, where we have one here with over 1 million handmade painted porcelain sunflower seeds, and what happens is he creates a large installation with this kind of a field, and eventually what happens is people will start to actually walk within the field itself, and become an active part of it, and of course physically touch the sunflower seeds. And you can only imagine that by the time the exhibition is over, there's probably a few sunflower seeds that have made their way out the front door by way of visitor as well. Here are some wonderful shots of some of the installations where, as I mentioned, eventually people will just start to make their way into the field and become part of the installation and how they're actually interacting with the sunflower seeds themselves. In 2011, Ai Weiwei was arrested by the Chinese government and was actually held in prison for multiple years. His studio space was actually completely demolished, and this was kind of the product of a culmination of years of being an avant-garde artist in China and pushing back against the system and doing multiple projects that, again, show the humanitarian problems within his native country. When he is eventually released, he will leave China and will create a series of works based on his time when he was actually held in prison. As a form of documentation of his time in prison, Ai Weiwei created the work Sacred, which is a six-part installation consisting of six separate sculptural boxes, of which the viewer will approach the box and look through different portals into the interior. This is, again, kind of giving this sense of claustrophobia and almost this sense of peeking into a separate world, but visually inside of the boxes, what Ai Weiwei has created are these wonderful dioramas that show the incredibly harsh conditions that he was subjected to for the time he was in prison. Here we have a detail from Ritual where, again, you can see this is interesting because in comparison to his other work, he's not really reforming anything as much as he's just creating a visual analog to the experience that he had using somewhat realistic figures. Each of the letters in Sacred forms an acronym. In this case, we have accusers, and we can see them within his room, the two gentlemen who are essentially accusing him of various things. I believe he was actually held on tax evasion as the primary reason for being put in jail. But it becomes pretty harsh, and you can see these living conditions that he had. You'll notice that you've got these gentlemen from the military who are essentially constantly keeping an eye on him, no matter his activities, including things like going to the bathroom or taking a shower, things that are incredibly private activities. He also had people watching him while he slept, and again, if you can only imagine how disturbing this must have actually been, and if you can kind of compound this over an extended period of time, it creates this psychological damage to the prisoner. And again, this documentation of it is an important part of the events that actually occurred to Ai Weiwei. For Ai Weiwei's next project, he created a series of 12 animal heads based off of animal heads that were part of the old Summer Palace's water clock in Beijing that were looted by French and English soldiers. These were brought back to the various countries, but what we have is this kind of imaging of what the clock might have looked like there in the Summer Palace. You can see this overlay of the drawing on top of the location there of an older photograph of the location. You can see that Ai Weiwei has radically changed how the animals look, and what he's done is he's almost created this grisly version of it, as we can see from Sao Paulo, Brazil, of these really just like animal heads that are almost too realistic in how they're being presented. He's created multiple versions of these heads and installed them in various locations around the world. Here's an image from the installation that he has in New York City, where again you can see that they're facing outward rather than inward towards the fountain. And in this case, they're just arranged in a single line rather than being in a circular arrangement. And again, he has several versions of this, and you can see this in comparison. Here's one from Houston, Texas. You can see a comparison of the scale of these animal heads to the people, and they're just incredibly large for the most part, oversized from what they would be in real life, but at the same time, most of the animal heads kind of share a similar scale to each other. Here are some of the details of the heads. This is a dog head sculpture, and as I mentioned before, it's almost a little bit too realistic, and it has this very, very horror kind of feel to have these animal heads almost on like pig poles, pardon the phrase, arranged in a circle. We also, of course, have animals like the dragon, which aren't quite what we would think of as real creatures, but you can see the amazing amount of detail and beauty that has actually been put into this sculptural head. And as I mentioned before, there are several copies of this that he's created in various mediums. Here's yet another version of it in gold, and this is actually at the Moscow Museum of Contemporary Art. We also see the continuation of a lot of the motive ideas that we have within his earlier work. Things like the bicycle that is now stacked, and you can see that this is an installation that now contains 760 of these bicycles. And again, it's kind of fun to see as his career progresses the growing number of these bicycles in the sculptures. He also does more of these kind of refiguring of older pieces, in this case 40 antique wooden stools from the Qin dynasty. He's kind of recreated into this circular form, referring to it as grapes. Here we have a close-up of the individual pieces, and it's amazing to kind of see the different surfaces that are actually present on these stools. And again, with them being antiques, you would have to imagine that they would have actually been used, and it kind of boggles the mind to put into place all of the individuals that probably sat on these different stools throughout the history of them being used. We also have other pieces where, again, he's using the porcelain and other materials that we see, again, rooted in traditional Chinese culture and traditional Chinese art. Here we have Free Speech Puzzle, again, arranged in the likeness of the country of China. In 2014, Ai Weiwei embarked on an ambitious project called Trace, where he created 176 two-dimensional portraits of people who are either or are political prisoners or prisoners of consciousness within their respective countries. This installation is incredibly massive, and it was first housed in Alcatraz there in San Francisco, and it had such an incredibly popular response. Over 1 million people came to see it, that it was then moved to the Hirshhorn to continue its activities. The really fascinating thing about this is not only do we have these portraits of these political prisoners, but the closer you get, you realize that these portraits are actually made out of building blocks, probably more commonly known as Lego, even though Lego tried to distance themselves a little bit from this project, some type of facsimile thereof, and most of these, I believe, were actually donated to Ai Weiwei. And again, it's kind of very interesting to see where some of these people are now in terms of their historical presence, because some of their realities have, of course, changed, and this is a dated piece from 2014. But here's a few kind of close-ups of some of the individuals, and again, here's a wonderful close-up where you can see the individual brickwork that was actually accomplished, how they were kind of laid flat and used to create these beautiful portraits in almost this posterized kind of style, where you can see the blue is being used in almost like a print type of fashion. When it was at the Hirshhorn, it also included this wallpaper that is the animal that looks like a llama but is really an alpaca. This very, very detailed wallpaper that was created by Ai Weiwei. In 2017, Ai Weiwei became deeply interested in the humanitarian crisis that was occurring by way of refugees, and created a series of artworks highlighting these issues, including this piece, which is a recreation of one of the rafts that many of the refugees used to cross the Mediterranean. He also started to do installations with these life jackets. These are life jackets that were usually bought by these refugees. Some of them actually don't even work, then are abandoned once they reach individual islands. In this case, you can see this is an installation of 14,000 of these. Here's a photograph of where he actually found them. Again, they were just kind of all littered on this hillside. What happens is these refugees arrive and they just abandon them and then go to essentially the refugee camps. This goes back to his reusage of materials, but it's in a very, very powerful way, with these actually being directly connected to individuals that made the refugee journey across the Mediterranean Sea. Through his work with the refugee crisis, he created the film Human Flow, which was released in 2017. This is a film, again, he creates films in addition to visual artwork. This is a whole nother part of his creative output. And again, this is a film that goes to various locations in the world and documents the migrational flow, and of course interacts with the individuals and gives a very human perspective on what was occurring. Also in 2017, he created these two large iron trees for the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. These trees are actually 26 feet tall, and as you can see, they kind of flank the entrance to this shrine, which actually holds the pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it seems a very, very appropriate symbol. We have all of these concepts of what trees represent in terms of knowledge and foundation, and him using this iron with it in coordination not only goes back to his reusing of materials, but is even more strengthening this concept of knowledge and the permanence of it. In addition, we also have an installation there, and you can see from this time period, and you can see on the back wall his famous series of photographs of him dropping the vase, and in the foreground we have a smaller installation of his famous sunflower seeds. Also in 2017 through 2018, he created a series of works in New York City called Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. And what's interesting about this is something that's integrated with technology where, again, you can go online and actually find where all of the different locations are. So you kind of had to go through your own migration through New York City in order to find all of these different sites. Some of the sites were very simple things like these posters that he created, again going back to his time creating the film Human Flow and documenting these individuals that were actually making these refugee journeys. Other things that we have, like Gilded Cage, is an actual full-size sculptural piece that an individual can then interact with there within the city itself. In addition to sculpture, he created a number of two-dimensional visual images around New York City, including these kind of patterns of very, very simplistic figures, again showing the cause and effect of why the refugee crisis was actually occurring. These come in various sizes, and as you can see from this one, in some instances he uses this kind of silhouette imagery of figures and places them in a mirror reflection, and we have this almost like Rorschach test kind of feel from it in this piece Exodus from 2017. The other thing that he did was he did a lot of smaller pieces in and around the city, and in some cases taking galvanized steel, kind of grading and incorporating them into what we would think of as the bus stop system. By doing this, he creates these smaller shelters, but you can kind of understand the effect of having to look through this fencing that was not normally there, and again reinterpreting it to the experiences that a lot of the refugees would have with the fences that they would encounter in any location that they would travel to. Again, this was a pretty massive installation that went around the entire city. Not only do we have pieces such as the shelters, but we also have these kind of flags that he created using a polymer material. And with these, he actually had portraits of people who have been refugees or migrants in and around the city. This gives a really, really human appeal to the idea of the refugee crisis, once you see these individual faces, it becomes a lot more humanized, and it doesn't just become the series of numbers that we're used to seeing in the news and things like that. It instead becomes something where it's like these are individuals that are actually taking part in this a very, very difficult aspect of life. And a lot of the pictures are of younger people, and of course that also brings into the reality that many of the refugees are parents and children who are leaving areas of war and conflict because, simply put, they're just trying to get their children to a safer location. And it's very fascinating the range of people that he actually includes. He includes historical figures like Victor Hugo into the conversation to remind us that, from the refugee crisis that have occurred before, from refugees and immigrants, a lot of tremendously beautiful pieces of art have been created. Another piece that he created was a cage that fits very evenly in the famous archway there in New York City. Within the space of the cage, you'll notice two figures in silhouette that are much larger than the space of a regular human being. With this, you can actually travel through the cage and, of course, through the archway by traveling through the outline of these two individuals. You'll notice that the material on the inside of this archway within an archway is reflective, so you have this experience of seeing yourself in almost this funhouse kind of way, walking through the archway, experiencing this larger cage in a way through it. And of course we draw parallels here between the basic idea that these people who are refugees are just regular people like you and I, and this reflection that you would see is kind of a reminder of that fact. He continues to create larger and larger bicycle sculptures. Here's another one of his pieces that he did in 2017 with over 1,200 bicycles that are actually used. These are kind of these larger installations that he's creating now in comparison to the smaller indoor ones that he had originally done, but they still have this very, very powerful effect. And it's this overarching that he's creating, this patterns of sculpture within sculpture that really becomes this attractive aspect to these bicycle sculptures. As we examine a few more of his bicycle sculptures that he's still creating into the contemporary, we are reminded that he's actually working on several films right now. He actually just finished a film called Cockroach, which is available online, which is a documentation of the 2019 pro-democracy protests that occurred in Hong Kong. He is also creating a film that documents the coronavirus in the Chinese response to it, that will be available in the near future.